A story from Smitten Rainbows. I was in Fort Sam Houston, Texas for medical training as an Army private a few weeks earlier. I was fairly new to the environment, just fresh out of basic combat training, which may very well explain a few things I witnessed, or things I thought I witnessed rather. I was tired most of all, and perhaps didn't quite have all my senses together. Most days we were physically drained, and that goes for my judgment as well. Though I believe things may exist outside our human realm, I'm not one who experienced many things outside the ordinary. And that day, I could only gape at the bizarre. Like many military training grounds, Fort Sam Houston had been around for quite a long time, and so it's not uncommon for accounts of unusual events to circulate. Stories of abandoned barracks, haunted grounds, and supposed witnesses of restless beings and all. When you hear others talk of such things, it was more often than not becomes a laughing matter rather than a cause of concern. But I can't deny, some of these stories make for the best kind of entertainment. Lights off was at 9 o'clock as always. Usually, I fall asleep as soon as I close my eyes, but it was just one of those nights when the brain chooses not to cooperate. So I laid in the darkness for a while and eventually drifted off. I could swear it wasn't more than 5 minutes until I jolted awake. This had happened a few times before, so I shrugged it off and tried dozing off once more. But I couldn't go back to sleep that time around. It felt a little strange, like I wasn't tired at all. I had 3 hours till wake up, and was upset at that thought. I remembered feeling incredibly dehydrated. As I tried to reach for my bottle, I realized I had forgotten to refill it that afternoon. Even more upset this time, I looked around the room, and both my roommate were sound asleep. The only accessible water source was the one through the basement, so my initial thought was to hurry down lest I resort to tap water. During training, the Army enforces that we call the Battle Buddy system, wherein you must have another training soldier with you at all times, or face consequences if caught alone. I admit I've gotten away without a buddy a few times before. I couldn't possibly wake my roommates up for a bottle of water. Our room was right by the door that led to the basement. I would definitely make it back in less than 2 minutes. Definitely. Our establishment was short-staffed, and I knew there weren't many drill sergeants that may have been roaming around that night. And so, being myself, I decided to risk it. Yes, I was goddamn thirsty. I quietly took my bottle, slipped out our door and into the dimly lit hallway. I took a few steps toward the basement door, reached for the handle, and slipped in. No drill sergeants. Easy peasy. I jogged down the steps and scrambled for the fountain to my left. The basement was lit and much less intimidating than it may sound. I filled my bottle and jogged to the door once more. I made it to the hallway and reached into my pocket. I reached in deeper and came to a horrendous realization. I had left the keys inside. I didn't have my phone, and knocking would wake up the entire floor. I fretted and stood there for a while, almost pulling my hair out. I glanced up and squinted my eyes at the figure moving down the hallway toward me. As I realized who it was, I prepared for possibly the worst. The drill sergeant towered about a couple feet over me. The lights lacked so much that I almost couldn't make out his features. The brim of his hat covered much of his face, but even though the faulty light, he was noticeably pale, greatly contrasting from his camo uniform. He tilted his head, but I couldn't determine where he set his gaze. You'd normally expect howling and the awakening of the whole floor when caught in a situation like this, being a private in training, and so I held my breath. "Just grabbing some water?" he asked, somewhat robotically, almost timid, forgetting how to speak for a while. "Yes, Drill Sergeant. I had forgotten my key. Inside, but this door here..." He cuts me off, languidly pointing at my room door. "Yes, Drill Sergeant," I replied hurriedly. Still unfazed, he takes out a key and slowly, oh so slowly, unlocks and leaves the door ajar, letting out a faint creak. I thanked him, trying to seem enthusiastic. He paused, as if not knowing how to respond. "Hydrate well, yes?" he uttered. I agreed to him before I rushed inside. I took a quick glance. I thought I saw a pair of beady eyes glisten from within the shadow of his hat. Then the door closed behind me. Following that incident, the day continued just as it always had. I didn't mention the details to my roommate, knowing they would very much suggest it was all a dream and, of course, think of me an idiot for going out alone. But later that evening, our usual drill sergeant sent out word for me and a buddy to report to the office as soon as possible, and so I grabbed a friend and headed that way. I had completely forgotten that there were CCTVs in every hallway, corner, and floor pod. "Can you explain what you were doing outside your pod past midnight, Private?" Drill Sergeant Smith raised his eyebrows, showcasing a CCTV footage on the screen just above us. "No battle buddy, no nothing," he continued. With all the guilt in my visage, I state my attempt to get some water and that I had forgotten my keys. I mentioned how the drill sergeant on duty kindly opened the door for me. He asked me who opened the door, but I couldn't say the name. I only described what I saw. Male, tall, and pale. "There were no male drill sergeants on duty last night." "I'm sure the drill sergeant opened my door. The footage should be able to say so, Drill Sergeant." I replied quickly. He gave me a look my mother gives me when she suspects dishonesty, but as I tried not to flinch, his look softened with concern. He bid me towards the screen and play the footage. There I was amidst the dimly lit hallway, still in front of my doorway, standing still for what looked like a good 20 minutes recorded. There was no one else in sight, no other trainees, no drill sergeants. Before he paused the footage, I watched as my door opened ever so slightly, just like that night. Before I could point it out, I was coined for careless behavior, dishonesty, as well as stripped of some of my privileges. It was all right. It wasn't a big loss. I went back to the barracks, baffled and feeling dazed. Maybe I was dreaming? A hyper-realistic dream? Have I been sleepwalking? I've never done so before. Have I finally gone mad? I attempted to recall the person from that night, if he even was a person at all, but the image of him blurred a bit from my memory. I made it back to my room, and I noticed the door propped open. I've known my roommate to prop the door open when they go to fetch laundry. I paid no mind and went inside, leaving the door propped. I set my things down on my desk and began rummaging through them. I remember looking for my ID, my room key. I found my ID buried in between my book pages. I was agitated about my key, thinking I might have lost it again. I stood my bunk and looked around, almost missing a glint at the corner of my eye. I adjusted to the light. There, on the foot of my bed, was my key, along with a thin piece of crumpled brown paper that scribbled, "Yours?" I began to feel uneasy. I asked my roommates if they had happened to pick up my key and wrote me the note. They appeared clueless and told me neither of them had. I assumed maybe our neighbors had picked it up. I've lost my key before. Maybe they just assumed it was mine. Still, I couldn't help but think otherwise. Here's a story from Book Thief 8. Over the summer, I lost my job when the gay bar I was working at shut down. Fortunately, I was able to get a new gig in the village. Sure, I had to schlep all the way from Ozone Park, Queens to Manhattan, but since I only had to take one train instead of two, it was actually a shorter commute. At 4 in the morning, when I'm dead tired and the bar is closed, 20 minutes not spent waiting to transfer at Hoyt Schermerhorn means 20 more minutes of sleep. Plus, the bar stayed relatively busy until those early morning hours. Older customers would stick around to buy one last drink for the young twink they were eyeing all night, in hopes their standards were finally low enough to go home with him. About 2 weeks ago, I was working one of these closing shifts on Sunday night. It was quieter than usual, with the work week starting the next day, and fall having brought in one of the first real weeks of chill and rain, so I got out there relatively quickly. My fall coat was still buried in a bin deep in my closet, so I hurried to the relative warmth of the subway just around the corner at West 4th. I swiped my card and found a seat on a bench on the downtown platform, fiddling on my phone while I waited for my train. According to the countdown clock, it was only 15 minutes away. A quick wait for this time of the night. Still, with the train running local, it'd be another hour and a half until I was home and in bed. I barely looked up from my phone when the A train pulled into the station. I just stood and walking toward the yellow line, clicking up the volume on my headphones so I could hear my podcast over the screech and off the brakes. I didn't notice anything odd until the door opened in front of me. I looked up and about to step forward, but stopped. The subway car in front of me was pitch black. This wasn't completely abnormal. The A line was full of older cars like these, whose lights would flicker or air conditioners would fail. You had to thank the MTA for the crumbling infrastructure. Usually, you would just pack into the next car, but as I stood there, staring into the sweaty dark, I could see shapes of people, at least a dozen, sitting, standing, a few even crouching, fingers pressed against the floor. For balance, maybe. There was something wrong with their heads, though. They were bigger and misshapen somehow. I didn't stay long enough to suss it out. I jogged to the next train car, lit in harsh fluorescent, slipping inside just as the door closed behind me. I took the first seat I saw and pulled the headphone out of my ears. I needed the silence. I don't know how long I just sat there, rocking as the train moved between stations. It was somewhere under the East River that I snapped back into awareness and looked around, searching for what? Someone else looking as confused as I was, but the subway car I sat in was nearly empty. A homeless man slept across a row of seats toward the middle of the car, and 2 drunk girls whispered to each other at the far end. I wondered if my tired brain had somehow just imagined it. I was listening to a comedy horror podcast about vampires, after all. So I stood and cautiously stepped over to the doors between the subway cars, peering through the windows. It was legal to move between them, but I had no intention of stepping through that threshold. The other car was indeed dark, but if I squinted, I could make out those strange human shapes with the weird heads, but I could not make sense of them. The one standing closest to me, who I could make out the most clearly, wore something oblong, with spindly arms like tree branches coming from the top. The train suddenly shook as we went over a bump, and the lights in the other train flashed on, just for a moment. Instinctually, I recoiled. They weren't branches, they were antlers, attached to a very realistic looking deer mask. Another bump. A few more shuddering flashes of light, like a strobe. There were dozens of them, filling the entire train car. Men and women dressed in identical black suits, and on their heads were animal masks. Not just deer, but bears and pigs and rhinoceroses. Even far in the back, the head of a giraffe. It peaked above the others, neck flopping almost comically as the train shook. Nobody was moving or talking or even looking at each other. They just stood, stock still, staring at nothing. Another bump, another flash, and suddenly they had moved, but only slightly. Every head was now turned. Every head was now looking at me. I fell back into my seat, pressing my back against the wall, as far as it would go. My heart was thundering. I looked around the train car again. At some point, the two girls must have gotten off, leaving me alone with the sleeping homeless man. I almost wanted to wake him, to drag him to the window and look, but an empty whiskey bottle rolled on the floor beneath him. He probably wasn't the most reliable person to check my sanity. I tried to rationalize what I saw. Halloween was that week, and I'd seen weird performance art on the subway before, since the annual No Pants subway ride, but those people were just in their boxers, in the light of day. I even saw a marching band lead a group of people in papier-mâché masks through the subway station once. But again, those people were laughing and talking amongst themselves, having a good time. I couldn't tell what those people were doing. We pulled into a subway station, 80th Street. Somehow, I had made it through all of Brooklyn without even noticing. We were in Queens now, thundering along the elevated tracks, just 2 stops from home. I stayed pressed into the corner the entire time, bolting into the cool air as soon as the door opened. Breathing heavy, I looked out onto the boulevard below. The train platform was empty, but there, beneath me, there were cars and life and people. But something drew my eyes away from all that. Something made me slowly turn around to stare into that dark subway car. A feeling I recognized later on the back of my neck of being watched. The subway doors were open, and standing there, visible in the station's yellow light, was the man in the deer mask. I expected to look rubbery and fake, the kind of mask you could buy for $10 on eBay. But the fur, the antlers, the eyes, they looked just like the taxidermy deer heads on my uncle's wall. There was something, too, glinting around the man's neck, something dark and wet and dripping. But the doors closed and the train peeled away, curving south toward Far Rockaway, before I realized what it was. Blood. This is a story from Sidley Stan, the Plan Man. I don't know what to do. It all started 3 weeks ago. My mom disappeared. She just vanished into thin air. She was there in the morning, nothing different. She hugged me goodbye, wished me luck with school, and gave me a packed lunch. She was gone when I got home that evening. She didn't come back. We called the police, me and my dad, and a search was set up, but there was no trail to follow. She had completely vanished. The whole town came together and held a giant search party, lasting through the night. We swept the town from end to end. No sign of her. Sniffer dogs couldn't catch a scent. It was as if she had literally vanished. The weeks since were hell for both me and my dad. Rumors started spreading through the town, and particularly around school, that my mom had been murdered. I moved from a general background character to the center of unwanted attention. People wouldn't stop asking me whether I thought she was murdered. Did I think my dad had murdered her? A lot of people were starting to think my dad had done it. I used to say that he couldn't have, but I'm not sure anymore. Dad took things a lot worse than I did. Most days he was locked away in his garage. He's a carpenter by trade, so it wasn't unusual behavior for him to disappear into a garage for long stretches to work on a chair or a table or something. It's what he always did when he was stressed. I figured that's just how he was dealing with grief. We barely spoke over the next couple weeks. He was locked in there from sunrise to midnight. We might bump into each other at one point, but he'd just grunt in greeting and go to bed. Sure, it was a bit weird, but he was going through a lot. What was I supposed to think? But the longer he spent in there, the less I was sure he was doing woodwork. There were large bottles of bleach popping up in our bins, and Dad barely took any breaks, maybe creeping out for a couple of hours of sleep. He always locked in the garage. One night, I had waited for him to go to sleep and crept down to try and open the door, but it was locked tight and Dad always had the key. But today, I came home from school and he was in the kitchen. Freshly shaved, showered, rested. It was a complete change for what he's been like for the last couple of weeks. He was cooking. Dad loved grilling, and his steaks are always amazingly cooked. It was a nice change after a few weeks of feeding myself pot noodles and soup. He sat down for two of the biggest, bloodiest steak I had ever seen in my life. But he looked kind of different. Not bad, but just different. Dad tucked in straight away and I followed suit. It was a bit on the stringier side, but the seasoning and flavors Dad had used made it taste just as good as the rest of his steaks were. Pretty soon we had finished. Then Dad said something that I can't stop thinking about. I doubt they'll ever find her body. It was the way he said it. He didn't sound sad or depressed. He sounded more content. I don't know, but hearing him say it sent shivers down my spine. Then I thought of the steaks, the late nights in the garage, the bleach. Did he feed me her body? Am I just overthinking it? What do I do?